Well, good afternoon and welcome to our panel on Michigan politics. So nice to see so many of you here that don't have any connection to anyone on the panel, Mike. We've got three very good papers, it turns out, so I'm glad that we have at least a few people here to hear them. Two of the papers, as it turns out, are award-winning papers. The authors did not know that until moments ago, I think, and maybe just now. The other paper would be award-winning, except there's no award category for which it qualifies. But other than that, I'm sure that it would. My name is John Clark, and I'm from Western Michigan University. And I'll serve as chair for the panel. It turns out I'm also co-author of one of the papers, the non-award-winning paper. We'll take them in the order that they're listed in the program, if you've got your program with you. But let me introduce the panelists who are conveniently sitting in the order that they're listed in the program.
We knew it.
The first paper is by Ken Winter, who is both a graduate student at Central Michigan University and also an adjunct faculty member at North Central Michigan College in Petoskey, the host of next year's meeting. Ken's paper, it turns out, is the best paper by a graduate student presented at this year's meeting. And so congratulations to Ken.
Thank you.
The next paper is by Brad Kent from Western Michigan University and from the Michigan Democratic Party. Brad is a recent graduate of Western, and his paper wins the award for the best paper by an undergraduate student at a four-year college or university. Those papers did not have to be presented at the meeting, but Brad was interested in presenting the paper, and I was delighted to have him on our panel today. And then finally, Tyler Hughes, also Western Michigan University, with his co-author, me. And Tyler will be responsible for all of the things that I did wrong in the paper and presenting it too. So Ken, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Given my background of almost 40 years as a journalist, I decided to go back for a second master's degree in political science. I have one in education. And near and dear to my heart, I guess, and this is really my first academic paper in political science department, it has to do with the media. And there's such a crossroads between the two, political science, democracy, and the media. And my policy, public policy issue was, should the United States government create public policies and laws to protect the news media, particularly print newspapers, understanding their value to our democracy? It was just about a year ago at this time, there was a sort of a quiet meeting of about a dozen of my former colleagues in Lansing, and it was sort of the who's who of the Michigan Capitol Press Corps, and all of us were concerned, including several Pulitzer Prize winners, about what's happened to journalism in Michigan. As a matter of fact, there's only about 5 to 6 people that really cover the state capitol, compared to when I was really active in journalism, we had several dozen. And the concern is that really no one's watching government. What you see basically right now is a product of either public radio, Rick Pluta, who actively covers Michigan Radio Network, and you see maybe you have 2 reporters for the Associated Press now and 1 freelancer. And the Detroit News just fired its second Lansing reporter, so it's down to 1, and the Free Press has 2. And the Lansing State Journal, a Gannett paper, really doesn't have a reporter that's full-time. So we have this massive state government that used to have a reporter covering each function of the government no longer existing. And unfortunately, people don't really understand that and aren't in the media. The media to me is important, the news media, because it's really our basis for information, and we're not really getting much other than news releases that are coming out of the governor's office or the paid people in the Michigan legislature that produce them. And really, bloggers, believe it or not, are now driving the news agenda in Lansing. And I can't seem to get a lot of interest, but nevertheless, we all sort of got together on the invitation of Phil Power, who 2 years ago was our speaker here, a former regent of U of M, but actually for 40 years he owned a group of 62 community newspapers. In Michigan, they surrounded the Detroit area. And he, like I, really told the group that we're not interested in getting back to being publishers again. I was editor and publisher of the Petoskey News Review, and he his own organization. But we both are very passionate and concerned about the direction that we see taking place in Lansing. So he called us all together for a lunch, and we talked a little bit about directions of what could maybe happen. And Phil's actually 71 years old, and I'm 60, but we both have seen how the decline of the Lansing Media has taken place. And to us, particularly right now, if you haven't been watching what Phil's done with the Center for Michigan, he actually, this election has taken over what the Lansing Media has historically done. He's been trying to characterize the accuracy of political advertising, something that we've always done. And I think that both of us have come to the conclusion that after this election, we're going to try to, in some way, reinvent Lansing press coverage. I tried myself last year to form a nonprofit group with a couple people who I knew were laid off, just to at least spend some, if not investigative, some in-depth reporting of what was happening in Lansing, and found that the distance between Petoskey and Lansing, even though that's my hometown, it's just too hard to negotiate things. But I think Phil, with a fellow by the name of John Bebo, who's his executive director, but a longtime award-winning journalist himself that I know, we're going to try to come together with maybe a nonprofit organization that maybe could hire a couple people and farm out the stories to area newspapers. There's another quiet effort going on through the Michigan Press Association, which I've been involved with, in the foundation, that we too are trying to look for a matching grant from the Knight Foundation to maybe hire a couple other reporters to provide news, either as a supplement to the Michigan State University Capital News Reporting Service, or just independently. But anyway, this October lunch, we sort of came to the conclusion that there really is no Lansing coverage. What you see at Associated Press isn't much. There's not a lot of really good questioning what's happening. It's quite evident in this election. In my own personal opinion, it's being driven by negative ads and presentations. And for a democracy, this is critical. And it's not that the press has ever been historically perfect, but it's been better than anything else we've had. So my paper today, as I was looking at the issue, I learned that we really were not unique in Michigan, but the Michigan papers are sort of what we call the ground zero of what's happening in news media. A lot of people think the print newspapers are gone. I would argue that maybe the print portion of news is declining in major markets. The community newspapers, such as in Traverse City, in my community, and a lot of the other smaller communities are quite strong. In fact, nationally, readership of news is the highest it's ever been. It's just mostly coming out of online news, and the collision course is, of course, you don't pay for that. And right now, what's happening in the news industry is that they don't have an economic model anymore that's working to support the print newspapers. And for those of you who aren't familiar with print newspapers, those are the people who have traditionally paid for what I call on-the-street reporters that actually go out and get information. And that information then is then fed through places like Associated Press or other places. But they're the ones who've always historically had the time to ask the deeper questions. They've had the institutional memory in their communities, and that's all evaporated. Right now, we've got several major projects going on. The Detroit News and Free Press, as of course most of you know, a year ago, eliminated 4 of their print editions in telling people that basically you're going to read those days online, and that your 3 other days, the major one being Sunday, will provide you some print news. The Ann Arbor News, which I just visited again this summer, they've the first time in 147 years last year closed down their print edition. It's all entirely online, and they have a separate company, but it happens to be owned by the Newhouse family, who actually owns all the other major Michigan dailies, everything from the Grand Rapids Press to the Jackson Citizen Patriot, Kalamazoo, Muskegon, and then over on the other side, Saginaw, Bay City, and Flint. And they're sort of following that same model that the Detroit News and Free Press are in some markets. Saginaw and Bay City are really only printing 3 times a week and relying on delivery of the news online. And then in Grand Rapids Press is still printing every day of the week, as Kalamazoo and Muskegon are. No one really has a solution. The idea of cutting back these publications was to cut back the tremendous overhead that is involved with the printing press and delivering the paper, hoping that they could then continue to support what's taking place to support the staffs that they want to support to cover the news. I think this all really sort of started back in 1982 when Knight Ridder Corporation that owned the Detroit Free Press had a meltdown. And it all happened because a fellow that actually lives next door to my father-in-law in Naples, Bruce Sherman, had a private capital management company, and unlike most other investors, he successfully operated out of Naples and not Wall Street, and quietly bought a lot of majority interest, or a lot of significant interests in newspapers across the country, and made millions of dollars for his clients. I don't know that most people know that newspapers operate on a margin of anywhere between 25 to 35% profit pre-tax. Now you compare that to a grocery store that makes a 0.5% margin, you get sort of an idea. And if a business gets 6 or 7%, they're very happy. So these have been cash cows for many years, and Bruce knew that. And when they stopped producing the returns that he was used to, they started dropping down to 18%, which is unmanageable in most corporations. He started forcing the publicly traded companies like Knight Ridder to either produce or sell. And finally, after several years, he was able to force the Knight Ridder company, had 32 daily newspapers worth about $6.5 billion to sell. And they broke up the chain. And that was really sort of one of the models, one of the ideals for journalism in the United States. And as a result of that, that sort of started a domino effect with a lot of publicly traded companies. The ones like the New York Times and is an example of where, because they have two classes of stock, the family still maintains control of the Class A stock, so they really can't be taken over. But Knight Ridder did not have that opportunity. Jack and Jim Knight, for some reason, didn't have a class of stock that kept the ownership within the family, and so it was all completely publicly traded when they joined with the Ridder family from California to form the largest circulation newspaper group in the country. Gannett is also a target for the same reason. And having worked for Gannett at one time, there's always this pressure for publicly traded companies to produce profits and returns. Unlike the family-owned newspapers, like the Detroit News was at one time with the Scripps family, and also a lot of ones in Michigan, the demands by the family to produce profit wasn't as high, so there was more value placed upon the quality of news and putting out, covering things, particularly in Lansing, some having Washington bureaus and some even having international bureaus, like the Minneapolis St. Paul Tribune and the Chicago Tribune. These are papers beyond the traditional LA Times and New York Times that have always historically done it. I was interested in the whole idea and then found out this was not just unique to us. I think it was best summarized by a one-time Pulitzer Prize newspaper publisher and journalist who is now the CEO of the Freedom Center, which owns the Museum and First Amendment Center, Charles Ogilvie, who's a friend of mine. He used to be a publisher and editor in Mississippi and received the Pulitzer Prize back for his coverage of civil rights. And he was honored last year by a national education group, and basically his comments were that internet ad rates are less than 1% of newspaper print ad rates, and that's part of the problem for those of you who aren't familiar with the economics of newspapers. Newspapers basically were supported by these print ads, these display ads, and they received a lot more revenue than the little internet ads that you see now. And he said those ad rates won't come close to paying for the newsrooms. If the free content trends continue, you can bet the size of newsrooms will decrease even more. That is bad for local communities, it is bad for journalism, and it is bad for our democracy. I believe that the trend can be reserved and the people will pay for news, perhaps in a combination of print and internet, but readers will have to see and understand the value. They will not pay for a newspaper's equivalent that continues to shrink in size. And ironically, this last month, USA Today announced a massive set of layoffs in its own newsroom, and it's never really been historically known for being a significant news provider other than just sort of surface news compared to the New York Times or the LA Times, or at one time the Chicago Tribune, which is right now in receivership. He said a free press does not always mean free news. The survival of a free press is known as we know it, depends on public paying for it. Understand that I'm not saying if we want newspaper-sized newsrooms, people have to pay for it. If robust-sized newsrooms are not the issue, then it doesn't matter. We must resist the notion that the internet, social networking, and Twitter can adequately replace newspaper-sized newsrooms. This doesn't mean that you have to be against those new media. They are nice add-ons, but they are not substantial replacement. Generally speaking, the only news source spending serious money for robust money for covering local news is newspapers. So he's sort of reaffirming what most of us in the news industry are aware of. And Steve Lacey, who is a colleague, and I also teach a little bit at Michigan State, he's now a journalism professor, but also associate dean for this College of Communication Arts, said that citizen journalism is not a replacement for commercial journalism, but it can be a useful supplement. Local governments continue to be covered fairly well by news organizations, but that coverage varies. State coverage increasingly comes from the Associated Press, which is really just a redistribution for the most part of mediocre news coming out of local papers. A huge problem with online news is poorly designed websites that make navigation difficult. The package needs to be improved, any new efforts to come. So when we talk about the public policy issue, not only for Michigan but for nationwide, the question surfaces as whether or not the U.S. government should create public policies and laws to protect the news media, particularly print newspapers, understanding their value to democracy. So that we could look at this area, I came up along with some research from Ben Scott, the policy director for Free Press, a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to reforming the media, with these underlying principles that we need to keep in mind. First of all, protect the First Amendment. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press are essential to a free society and a functioning democracy. And I think that most people in the political science arena would certainly understand that. Everyone should have right to access and impart information to the media of their choice. Produce quality coverage, which is my major concern right now. To self-govern in a democratic society, the public needs in-depth reporting on local issues as well as national and international affairs that is accurate, credible, and verifiable. We also need to be looking at as a baseline for public policy, provide adversarial perspectives. In other words, reporting must hold the powerful accountable by scrutinizing the actions of government and corporations. Journalism should foster genuine debates and discourse. We should be promoting, as a news business in our public policy, public accountability. Newsrooms must serve the public interest, not private or government aims, or should be treated primarily as a public service, not a commodity. And journalism must be responsive to the needs of diverse and changing communities. And this is the issue, I think. Part of it is that journalism has become commercial. It is owned by mostly major corporations, and as a result of that, the pressure to produce quarterly profits and maintain stock value has superseded the concept that I grew up with, and that was for the quality of information reporting to the readers. And then finally, we need to prioritize innovation. Journalists must utilize new tools and technology to report and deliver the news. The public needs journalism that crosses traditional boundaries and is accessible to the broadest range of people across the platforms. So basically, I looked at four models that are solutions to this problem of poor news coverage that's been taking place in national and even statewide. And I found that they're really just, right now, there are four models, and the first one is called the government involvement model. And the government solutions vary from using existing authority granted in federal laws administered through federal agencies to expanding the role of government involvement in gathering the news. This is very, very true in most foreign countries, but has been sort of not true for us except for the area of public television and radio. Print press has really never had government control, though, as you know, the British tried to license newspapers early on at the beginning of our country. And as a result of that, many object to the government involvement of any nature because they argue government involvement breeds opportunity for eventual government manipulation and control, as demonstrated as we remember from the Nixon administration, the failed attempts to control the New York Times and the Washington Post during the Pentagon Papers and also during Watergate. and for many, including myself, most governmental solutions beyond those granted all citizens should be viewed with a great deal of skepticism. And I guess that's because I grew up in the 60s and had to deal with these issues as a student and then as a very young reporter. I don't have a lot of trust anymore in the information that is being contained or put out by the government, and we lose our watchdog role. One of the biggest promoters of the government involvement, though, using communication laws right now has been, ironically, U.S. Senator John Kerry, who's been has had a series of hearings that unfortunately were ellipsed by the economy and national health care last year, so no one really paid much attention to them, but they were held. He chairs the Subcommittee of Communication Technology and Internet of the United States Committee on Commerce, Science, and Technology. And what he was saying was that, explaining the government's interest during his opening remarks, he said, "We have the responsibility of licensing of broadcast, regulatory oversight of ownership of cable, satellite, and other issues with respect to communications." He said, "How the American people get information is of interest to everyone, as is the structure, because news and its availability is foundation to our democracy. If we take seriously the notion that the press is the fourth estate or the fourth branch of government," he continued, "then we need to examine the future of journalism in the digital age, what it means to our republic and to our democracy. Americans once counted on newspapers to be the rock of which journalism, the best sense of journalism, was based." And he cited, at that time, a recent Columbia Journalism Review article that was written by Princeton communication professor Paul Starr, who wrote that more than any other medium, newspapers have been our eyes on the state, our check on private business, our civic alarms. Newspapers have been a part of our daily license. We learn to read, to learn about our neighborhoods, our country, and our world. They've entertained us, enraged us, but always informed us. But these options are continuing to dwindle, and even in my own cursory observation, particularly in Michigan journalism, newspapers have really changed to being fluff, happy news kind of papers with really no bite in their editorials, at least in the smaller market community papers. And there are at least 6 different ways the government's trying to get involved with, and has been involved with, trying to provide some means to allow newspapers to continue. One is the Newspaper Vitalization Act, and that idea was that we'd make it easy for private and publicly held newspapers to change their current status to become nonprofit institutions, so there wouldn't be as much of a press for profit. The proposed act would not allow for government interference, nor would it be a federal bailout, but he said current discussions include prohibiting those newspapers to endorse local editorial people running for elections. And I guess that's sort of a problem, but that was sort of what the trade-off would be if we went that direction. They also suggested strengthening existing public agencies like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Federal Communications Commission, with the idea that they would allow papers to be more of a charitable trust. Also, they wanted to strengthen the copyright protection laws, and basically what's happening is the news that does get out now, unfortunately, is being taken by newspaper aggregators, which I don't think most people really understand, but when you go to a site, it doesn't really matter what it is, and you see like Google News, they're not producing that news. They're just stealing it off from print newspapers. And right now, it's almost impossible for a print newspaper because of the cost to protect its news content. So Google News gets it, aggregates it to its customers, and you get it for free, and no one's paying for the news that's being generated by the reporters back at these numerous newspaper sites. The other problem is, the other area that they're looking at is, and I'm not going to get into too much because it gets too complicated, but basically changing some of the IRS accounting rules that allows us to have a carryback longer for depreciation. And finally, relaxing some of the antitrust laws that we have that really prohibit us from talking sometimes collectively as a newspaper group. And finally, one of the disasters I thought, and I really didn't appreciate it when it happened, was the Newspaper Preservation Act of 1970, and that's the one that you see about, like, for example, what happened with the Detroit News and Free Press, where they combined their production, advertising, and marketing departments with the idea that the philosophy behind it was that it's healthy for us to have competing newspapers in the same market. And when we have one failing newspaper, we'd be allowed to break antitrust laws and combine some of our operations. Also, there's a thought of maybe using the FCC to provide funds and create news fund councils where each state would have its own fund council and then divide what they estimate could probably be a surcharge from telephone bills to provide monies to support news gathering organizations. The next model really is a nonprofit foundation supported model. Actually, there's one taking place here a little bit with the Rappian here in Grand Rapids. It's more of a citizen journalism site, which shouldn't be confused with news gathering. But basically, the idea is here that there have been nonprofit groups that have hired investigative reporters. They formed alliances with some major news distribution areas. And one that comes to example is the one in San Diego, where they have their own website and then they provide news to some of the other outlets. But they have a team of investigative reporters who go out and constantly watch civic, government, and private individuals and what they're doing and try to provide some depth reporting that is no longer being done by the major papers. There's another one where it would be a private paid and commercial model, and that's basically what we're familiar with now, where you would, like the Wall Street Journal, if you want to get their website, you got to pay for it. The Arkansas Democrat Gazette was really one of the only papers in the country that early on said, if you want our news off the website, you got to pay for it. But that doesn't seem to be working because most people that are used to for years getting free news don't want to pay for it now. To me, the best journalism model that could exist is maybe a private, low or nonprofit model with no government interference, where we're going to give some benefits to some companies and allow them to provide news distribution or newspapers without having the pressure that people have had in the past of having to work as a publicly traded company. There's really no complete answer as to what the best solution is, but what my concern is that, like I mentioned before, that we've had several dozen Lansing journalists just disappear. They either end up retiring or they've ended up working in state agencies or nonprofits around Lansing with no one really watching what's going on. And then you have the situation now where you really have no good source of news. I didn't read the entire report because I didn't think it was necessary today. I just sort of wanted to give you some highlights. But my concern is that it's hard to get public interest in it. I've talked to maybe a half a dozen civic organizations in our community. I've talked at our community college, and people start to finally get the fact that the news they're reading isn't really serious news, but they don't know how to attack it. And I know, still being active in the Michigan Press Association myself, it's a struggle. And what's the first thing to go? It's the Lansing bureaus and anything in Washington, and continue to lop off the local news coverage too. So really in your own backyard, you don't know what's going on in the city or county government either. I know I'm taking an ethics class this semester at CMU. I try to take a class a semester, and it's interesting. It's ethics really for public administration, but there's so many similarities between the news industry and public administration because both of our goals are to serve the same people. And I'm just concerned that if we continue this trend, we can't figure out a model to support news coverage, that it's going to have a serious effect on our democracy. Citizen journalism shouldn't be confused with what I call professional journalism. It's helpful, but it isn't the same.
Thank you, Ken. The next paper is by Brad Kent. The title of Brad's paper is Investigating Partisanship in a Nonpartisan Election, the Michigan Supreme Court, 2008.
Thanks, Dr. Clark. As Dr. Clark mentioned, I am a recent graduate from Western Michigan University. I took a break between two different undergraduate experiences, and I have a lot of experience working on local, state, and federal level elections. So when I came back to school, I picked a completely different major, of course, and political science seemed to make a lot of sense. And I was given the opportunity by Dr. Clark and another couple professors to take graduate level classes. So in those graduate level classes, I really tried to concentrate my own efforts on investigating what I could from an academic standpoint, the effects of campaigns are, because that's what I've worked on, and that is where a lot of my interest lies. So having worked during the 2008 campaign cycle in Michigan, I witnessed, not at a state level, but on the ground level, the Michigan Supreme Court election, and it was not an objective viewpoint that I had. I worked for Democrats, and I should mention that very clearly. But you know, there's great debate even within the party and certainly within political observers in the state about why Diane Marie Hathaway defeated Cliff Taylor in the 2008 election when it was accepted as near fact that incumbents don't lose Supreme Court elections in Michigan. So I tried to set about finding a way to investigate that. I also had a lot of interest in straight party voting, and I'm accustomed to accumulating information from county clerks, and so I decided to start gathering that information, and I found a way to put those two things together. So what this paper is a continuation of a relatively long but not particularly deep body of literature and nonpartisan elections. However, you know, a lot of other people who have written papers about nonpartisan elections have pointed out that there is hardly any literature. I didn't find that to be the case. There's a lot, and it goes back to the 50s, at least the 50s, but it doesn't get investigated nearly as often as other kinds of elections. So very briefly, you know, the literature on nonpartisan elections starts with Charles Adrian, who did a lot of his studying here in Michigan. He and Williams, who I'll find the first name of later, did a study on 4 Michigan cities, which they chose not to name, but I believe Kalamazoo was one of them. It seemed pretty evident from their description, in 1959. And one of the things that they really concentrated on was how much partisanship influences a nonpartisan election. You know, especially at that time, people alluded to Chicago a lot. Chicago politics seem to be completely controlled by a party, even when they are nonpartisan. And so they concentrated on machine-style politics and the effects of partisanship in a city on nonpartisan elections. And I'll come back to that later. But some things that have been found very consistently about nonpartisan elections is that turnout is depressed. This makes a lot of sense in the context of vote calculus literature. People that don't have partisan labels on a ballot don't have as much information as people who do. So in nonpartisan elections, turnout compared to the partisan portion of the ballot is uniformly lower. It allows us to look at voting cues other than partisanship, which I find really interesting, particularly in low information nonpartisan elections. You know, you get to find what other things can affect people's choices. If people don't really know who the people are and they don't have wall-to-wall media coverage about it and they aren't high-budget elections and they're nonpartisan, then what information do people use to make those decisions? And anything from you know, the apparent gender of a candidate to the apparent nationality or other cultural information of a candidate to nicknames that are allowed on some ballots. There's a particularly hilarious example from Wisconsin last year of what you get to put on a ballot, which I won't repeat here because it was profane. But in some states and in some locations, you get to put other things on the ballot, including what your profession is. And in some sense, that's what we do in Michigan for the Supreme Court elections. We put on there who is already a justice of the Supreme Court. Because that's one of the only pieces of information on the ballot other than a person's name, it was concluded after incumbents won for 24 years in a row that that indeed was something that made them nearly invincible. Another thing that's been mentioned in the literature a lot is a perceived Republican advantage in nonpartisan elections. This is not a one-sided argument. More people over the course of 50 years have decided that there is a Republican advantage, but a lot of that is old information, and the newer information compared with the first thoughts on the matter really seem to indicate that actually there is an advantage to the minority party. And since large nonpartisan elections occur in large cities, which tend to be more democratic, it appears to be a Republican advantage. But really, I personally would say it appears more to be an advantage for a minority party. Judicial elections, then, are a specific example of nonpartisan elections, and in fact, not all judicial elections throughout the country by a long shot are nonpartisan. There are three basic ways to elect judges that we practice currently in America: partisan elections, the Missouri plan, where people are simply supported or not supported, but they don't have an adversary on the ballot, and nonpartisan elections. And in the context of nonpartisan judicial elections, Michigan is a near unique situation. It's very similar to Ohio, actually, that we nominate our Supreme Court candidates at party conventions. However, the partisanship of the candidates does not appear on the ballot. So to people who don't make a solid effort to look up who their candidates would be, depending on their partisanship, it appears to be a nonpartisan election. And although this is not something that I examined in this paper at all, some people believe that the position on the ballot really matters, you know, if it's on the back of the ballot or the front of the ballot. The ballot example that I include in the paper actually comes from the front of a very large ballot that didn't have a back. So it is not the case that in all locations in Michigan the Supreme Court is on the back of a ballot, but it is very far down the ballot with you know, statewide proposals and local proposals. So in 2008, Cliff Taylor, who was an incumbent and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was on the ballot again. And 2008 is one of the years in Michigan where there was only one Supreme Court candidate on the ballot for each party. Usually there are two, because there are 7 members and they have 8-year terms. So only every second presidential election is there only one nominee from each party. The nominees were Cliff Taylor from the Republican Party, Diane Marie Hathaway from the Democratic Party, and Robert Rodas, perennial candidate from the Libertarian Party. So the hypotheses I tested in the paper were basically that, one, the environment surrounding the Supreme Court campaign was more partisan in 2008 than in the past, and so more partisan information was efficiently transferred to the electorate. And two, that I wanted to investigate straight party voters and whether or not, you know, the vote calculus literature might initially lead one to believe that straight party voters, because they're very partisan, would be high information voters, because partisanship takes information to form. And so if you only support Democrats or only support Republicans, you must have enough information to have determined that. So I created a couple of hypotheses based on the presumption that straight party voters are high information voters. However, anybody who has worked on elections could probably tell you that that is not always the case, and that's what I'll get to in a moment. The data that I collected to test these hypotheses was election results, aggregate information. It's not the case that we don't have any individual level information about the 2008 Michigan election, but I could not locate any about the Supreme Court election, and what we do have is fragmented throughout the state. I am not aware of a comprehensive large sample survey from the 2008 election in Michigan for, you know, Michigan-specific information. So I collected election results from 18 counties, 1,544 precincts. It's easy to collect a lot of the information from an election, but it's not easy to collect the straight party voting information from an election. Some counties make it very easy to accumulate on their websites. Other counties have a very difficult time even providing it to a person asking for it. And it is not something that's aggregated at the state level. The Secretary of State's office does not ask counties to report it, and they don't have any way of keeping it. So it's something you have to ask an individual county for. The worst case scenario is that you have to travel to a county clerk's office and look at totals tapes from election night that are printed out from voting machines. Fortunately, by the 2008 election, all counties in Michigan had optical scan voting machines, so all of them have totals tapes. However, they're not all the same brand, they're not all the same readability. So I traveled to a lot of counties and collected those. I also accumulated things online and via email, and in some cases through mail. So 1,544 precincts. it accounts for about 31% of the vote in the state, so it's a significant sample, but it is only 18 counties. So there are some tables in my paper, which I have several copies of here, and I encourage you guys to look at them, and I'll be very happy to take questions. But to kind of cut to it, what I did was I used the method of ecological inference to try to simulate individual level behavior from aggregate information. It's certainly not a method that is universally accepted, and it attempts to address the ecological inference problem. And so these are only simulations and estimates. However, the available methods to address this problem have been improved over the last 10 to 15 years, I think significantly, and really Dr. Corder at Western Michigan University helped me through this, and he thinks significantly, and some people do use it in research at this point. So I used that method, a specific kind of that method, to simulate individual level behavior. And first I'll say, one test that had nothing to do with ecological inference was to look at the ballot roll-off for the election and compare it to the last similar election, the 2000 election, where only one candidate from each party was on the ballot. And there was lower ballot roll-off in 2008 to the Supreme Court level than there was in 2000, but not much. Not enough for me to say, conclusively at all, that there was definitely more partisan information available to people, and therefore a much lower level of roll-off. It was similar, but lower. So to move on to the ecological inference part of it, first I performed a 2x2 ecological inference simulation to try to weed out how many people who voted straight party actually voted for any Supreme Court candidate. So of those who vote straight party, what is the ballot roll-off? And this is an estimate, it's a simulation, but I found that ballot roll-off was greater than 50% to the Supreme Court level among people who vote straight party, but very, very low, under 5%, for those who do not vote straight party. So it appears that people who vote straight party are much more likely not to travel all the way down the ticket, and therefore cannot be called, at least not uniformly, high information voters. I also did simulations both with presidential voters, so Obama voters, McCain voters, and anybody who voted for something else or didn't vote. There are very few people who did not vote for president, but looking at totals tapes, you can see about how many there were, and there are a handful. So I classified third party and presidential roll-off voters, I suppose we could call them, together, versus voters in the Supreme Court race. And so there are Roddice voters, Taylor voters, Hathaway voters, and those who do not vote at the Supreme Court level. So this is a 4x3 ecological inference simulation. And what that showed is that using presidential voting as a measure of partisanship, you don't really see a difference in the faithfulness to a party among individuals, but it doesn't show much of a difference between the two parties in faithfulness, and that's about it. And then comparing straight party vote to Supreme Court vote. So this is a 4x4 simulation, because you could vote straight party, Democrat, Republican, some other party, or not vote straight party, which many people do, or you could vote for any of the three Supreme Court candidates or not vote. That showed a really interesting result. Among people who do vote for Supreme Court, the party faithfulness was extraordinarily high. As you'll see if you want to take a copy of the paper, these are all marginal, I suppose I could say. This doesn't account for all of the percentage in the whole table, but among Democrats, it looks like about 90% of people voted for Hathaway. among people who voted straight party Democratic and bothered to vote for Supreme Court. And the same was almost true in the Republican side, although there were many, many more Democratic straight party votes. The roll-off, the failure to be faithful to one's party was slightly higher for Republicans, but still very, very high. So that does lend support to the idea of straight party voters being high information voters. In order to vote for the correct person at the Supreme Court level, you'd have to have information about that race. So we have conflicting information about that. This is sort of the most important point that I think I was able to make in the paper. It's that there are probably two different kinds of straight party voters, and that's something that you can say anecdotally, just walking around and talking to voters constantly. But interestingly, Campbell and Miller made the same point in 1957. They refused to be more parsimonious, is what they said, than to describe two different kinds of straight party voters, the indifferent straight ticket and the motivated straight ticket. And I agree with that model of straight ticket voting, at least based on this analysis. It appears, and it makes a lot of sense anecdotally, that some straight ticket voters simply go into a polling place, fill out straight party Democrat or straight party Republican, and then leave and don't vote on anything else. But those that do vote the rest of the ballot are high information voters because they are highly partisan. And that's pretty much the conclusion of the paper, and I'd be happy to take any questions after Tyler has his shot. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. And our last paper was written by Tyler Hughes and myself. Tyler's going to present it. The title of the paper is Campus Voting in Michigan, 2004 to 2008. And we got a couple tables in the back of our paper, so I'll pass out copies so you can look at the tables while you talk about it.
So the motivation for this paper is that there was a lot of excitement around campuses, particularly around, anecdotally, John noticed a lot in '08 happening around Western's campus. I was in my last year of undergrad at Fort Hays State in Hays, Kansas. We had, considering we're a small rural campus, we had a particularly large amount of excitement surrounding the campaign. And going into the campaign, people were suspecting that the student vote would come out, that the youth vote would finally be mobilized and would show up to the polls. Unfortunately, the exit polls did not show a substantial increase. So what motivated this paper was to figure out what exactly happened to the youth vote and whether or not the exit polls were adequately calculating what was going on. I think we're all fairly familiar with the patterns of low turnout among youth voters. Since the ratification of the 26th Amendment, allowing 18-year-olds to vote, there's been a drop-off. In '72, the youth vote, 18 to 24-year-olds, was 50%. In 2000, that dropped to 36%. And a lot of scholars don't think it's the youth vote is the apathetic, cynical, younger generation model that so many people like to talk about. Rather, they're just not mobilized, because when you look at these voters, these potential voters, at a community basis, they tend to be more involved in community activities and volunteerism than people in older generations. So it's not necessarily that they're apathetic, it's that they are simply not motivated. And one of the motivations, one of the biggest steps, one of the hurdles to get over is registration. When you move, depending on what your state's policies are or local policies are on registration, it can be incredibly difficult to move to your new college town and become registered in that city. In Kalamazoo, for instance, they require that your registration address be the same as your driver's license. So if you move to Kalamazoo from a different city, that would mean changing your driver's license, which creates a whole new mess as far as maybe car insurance, certainly ponying up to $25 to get a new driver's license, and just going down to the Secretary of State's office, which is, as I learned, trying to register a car this semester is a giant pain. So some hurdles to overcome there. But most people agree that registration is necessary, but hardly sufficient to get the vote out. So given this context, it felt like 2008 would be the campaign cycle that really turned this apathetic view of the youth vote around. As we saw, the Obama campaign really hit hard on online media, whether it be Facebook or Twitter or the like, and especially through the donations available on their website, things like that, connecting to students in an atmosphere that they're probably more familiar with, and getting a little more at that insular atmosphere that's created on college campuses. if you couple that with the fact that we had a very unpopular incumbent party coming into the election with no incumbent candidate, it seemed like the table was set for the youth vote to really turn out, especially in favor of the Democrats. However, what we saw with the exit polls that happened during the campaign, they only showed an 18% turnout for the youth vote, as compared to a 17% turnout in 2004, so a 1% increase, which amounted to about 2 million votes, which sounds substantial, but in the grand scheme of things, with 250 million voters, that does not really amount to much. So our question was, is this really what happened? Was the fervor that we saw on our own campuses, that it seemed like we saw nationwide, that analysts have been talking about for months and months heading into the campaign, was that superficial, or was there maybe a problem with what was going on in exit polls? And especially what we wanted to look at concerning exit polls is that people who conduct exit polls purposely try to target more heterogeneous precincts to grab a greater cross-section of the public when they poll. So our thought process was that a college precinct particularly involving a campus that would involve residence halls, what we affectionately dub student ghettos around the university, would be far more homogeneous and probably overlooked by exit pollers. So that's what we set off to do. In our selection process, like I said, we wanted to target these more homogeneous precincts. What that meant was looking at precinct maps, typically online through county clerks and city clerks' websites, in some cases calling them up and asking them, and finding campuses or finding precincts that encompassed a campus as a whole. And that's kind of what we based our selection process off of. From there, it was just a matter of pinpointing the proper precinct. If you're looking at the tables in the back of the paper, you'll notice that some of the college campuses have more than one precinct. What that meant was that precinct was divided along that campus was divided along precinct lines. So we included both precincts to make sure that just as part of our selection process, it made sense to do that. But we'll get at that in a moment. From there, we just had to go in through precinct level data, figure out registration numbers, election results for the president, both Democratic and Republican votes cast for the 04 and 08, and then compare those results. That was done in large part in Michigan by looking at the Secretary of State's election database, which very neatly organized everything by precinct for us. But the problem was, and Brad hinted at this, getting information about particular things from municipalities in Michigan can be a large headache. So the Secretary of State's office had everything we need except for registration numbers by precinct, which was a very important piece of the puzzle. So what that required was to contact city clerks by phone or by email, which resulted in sometimes an even larger headache. In some cases, this information was either not available or it was not practical for us to gather, and it involved getting rid of some of our precincts, which narrowed things considerably. I forgot to mention that we had a cutoff for institutions at an enrollment of 6,000. We felt it's somewhat arbitrary, but we felt that was a large enough student population to have both a large amount of residence halls and a large student population around the campus. We ended up throwing 3 precincts out because of problems gathering data. One was Marquette County, northern Michigan. Their city clerk had some problems changing databases, and information was changed and erased, so that became possible. And then the 2 universities that were large enough in Wayne County, Wayne State, and Detroit Mercy were both thrown out because it would have involved me driving to Detroit and giving money to the city clerk in order to get that information, which was not all that practical. So those precincts were ceremoniously thrown out. So that was our selection process and how we went about it. I should mention that our first attempt at this was a paper that we presented, that John presented. I was not there, at the Symposium on Southern Politics at the Citadel in South Carolina. That paper involved doing the same process but with North and South Carolina. And the idea was that we had a competitive state and a non-competitive state, and that allowed us to look at differences not only across precincts, but across states, and also to compare some demographic makeups of those universities. Particularly in those states, we were able to look at traditional universities and historically black colleges. So slightly different purposes, but the same process. What we found there was minimal at best, but certainly encouraging enough to continue the process. We found that we saw an increase for the Democratic vote, particularly at the historically black colleges. There were some mixed results, but we did find that North Carolina's newfound purple status certainly attributed to some increase of the college vote, while South Carolina, which remained an uncompetitive state, did not see really any change in the amount of student turnout in those two states. And one other final thing that kind of caught our attention was how candidate interaction tended to cause an increase in what we saw as an increase in student vote. I think it was Greensboro that
UNC Charlotte.
Charlotte that President Obama made an election eve visit to, and there was a huge increase in student turnout at that precinct that we attributed to that one-on-one time with the candidate. So given that little pretext, we'll just move straight in to the meat of the paper. What we looked at, and the two tables in the back of the paper are what I'll be talking about. We basically looked at the percentage change in registration numbers, Democratic support and Republican support between the 04 and 08 election. That's what Table 1 is. So from there, you can see some interesting things are happening. Just for clarification, since I'm looking at the table, the W's just mean that that's the ward and then the precinct. So in case you're wondering why some places have a W. Ann Arbor likes to do things different, as we're all very aware of. So the percentage change in increase, there was a dramatic percentage change in increase in registration among all but one precinct, and among the central, Grand Valley, and western precincts, that was nearly, that percentage change in registration nearly doubled. And we did show a very strong correlation between registration and turnout. So as registration went up, turnout also went up. However, turnout was not evenly distributed across the candidates. As you can see, votes for the Democratic candidate between 04 and 08 increased in 17 of the 19 precincts. The largest increase was a 306% change in the Grand Valley precinct, which was by far the most dramatic, and given the context of that precinct and historical voting there, very surprising. The return for McCain, on the other hand, as opposed to what President Obama saw, was mixed at best. 9 precincts saw at least a 10% increase, but a drop of at least of more than 10% in 7 of the precincts, and those were all typically on the east side of the state. Oakland and Eastern, for instance, are 2 of those precincts that we saw that change in. Also, the 2 Michigan satellite campuses that we looked at, Dearborn and Flint, saw pretty large decreases in the support for the Republican candidate. We also wanted to see whether or not changes in turnout for one candidate would possibly spur increases for the other opponent. So if turnout was up dramatically, then maybe it wouldn't necessarily be a zero-sum gain. Turnout for both candidates was nearly double that of what Kerry and Bush saw in 04 in both the Central Michigan precinct and for the Western precinct. The change in turnout for both the Democrats and Republicans was robust, which tells us that, well, basically, not only was turnout up, but turnout was up for both candidates. And finally, the last table, Table 2, is just vote share, kind of a zero-sum, trying to figure out if one candidate had gained a particular amount, if that translates into a loss for the other, if those votes are coming from a different place or possibly going to a different place, the increased support in the vote share table, table 2, shows increased support for the Democrats in 15 of the 19 precincts with an average increase across precincts of 6.4%, and then a decrease in 14 precincts for the Republican candidates between 04 and 08, and that average decline was 4%. Basically showing us that it was very zero-sum in that as we saw increases for the Democrats, we also saw those were taken away from Republicans between the 04 and 08 elections. As far as what this means, we started with this exit polling process. We were hamstrung by some institutional problems, some data gathering problems, certainly by the number of cases we had, but we thought Michigan was an excellent place to start. It appears that turnout was up in precincts, in all but one precinct, basically. When you look at the change in vote share, which is certainly encouraging for the idea that student vote was up without that being recorded in exit polls. The behavior may seem slightly marginal when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, considering the number of voters that are happening, but it is very reasonable that in a closer contested state that marginal increase would be enough to win victory for either candidate. There are some difficulties with this, though. For one thing, it means constant penetration by candidates into campuses every single year. This is obvious. Students are obviously a very transient population, with students moving possibly every 4 years, or 5 or 6, depending on how many victory laps you want to do. So replicating success for a candidate would be far more difficult, given the special context of the Obama campaign. We have yet to see if that is a special case or the new norm for as far as campaigns attack campuses. And we don't know whether or not the integration of this youth vote in 08 will become a reliable source for turnout in future elections, as we saw with Jimmy Carter's election, an increase in youth vote that they became disengendered and did not translate into future turnout for that same cohort. So that has yet to be seen. But our preliminary analysis of Michigan, and like we said, we'd like to possibly continue this in further states, does indicate that the youth vote was up, but possibly that turnout was masked by the way that exit polls are taken. So, be happy.
Thanks, Tyler. I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative at the end of our time together and make a few comments. But at this point, if there are any questions from the audience, I will Oprah the microphone over, since we are being taped.
Yeah.
My wife wanted to make sure that I wasn't just going out drinking with Tyler and Brad. Chris, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah. I wrote down stuff from all of them. Now I've got to remember. The second paper, you note that you have a sample of, what was it, 18?
18 counties.
18 counties.
Yep.
Did you do any testing to see how representative those 18, like the demographics of those counties, as far as racially, economically, they compared to the state in general? I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking a sample as long as that sample is representative of what Michigan looks like.
Right. I did not use census data to compare. I will say there was a comparison made for the sample politically, and it is slightly more Republican than the state as a whole, but not much. So no, I did not perform anything beyond a political analysis. That in the same election, it was a slightly more Republican population, and it was about 31% of the entire electorate.
Okay.
But I take your point, and I wondered the same thing. I didn't find it to be an easy enough task for the paper as I was trying to complete it at the time. But there are a lot of things that I would like to add to it. I have since collected some other data that I did not I did not, with any bias, omit. I just haven't added any data to the data set yet.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. Well, I've done that, it's funny, when I was a master's student, I was working with David Kimball at Southern Illinois University, and actually got to enter in 13,000 precinct over 3 races over 6 years. It took me.
You got to?
Well,
Oh, nice.
I did it and got, and it got me a couple of publications.
Yeah.
And I learned a great deal. I learned to hit save a lot when you're using SPSS, after losing 8 hours of entering. But anyway, that kind of stuff helps because, if you want to move forward this type of research, this EI, John, there's still a small group of EI people, even my buddy David, who was one of the first, he's kind of given up on it. But there are, and Kerry's still occasionally trying to tweak it, but like you said, it is a small group, Gary King first thought he'd fixed it, and then there were several scholars that kind of showed that, and even Gary had to admit it was wrong, but John, I remember I actually interviewed at Western, and John and I was talking about that, and he seemed to think it was fine, and we differ on that. On the, that's my, else ask a question before I go on, or? Okay. On this other paper, I was wondering, so you got the county clerks, and I understand, I've had to deal with these people many times. Try calling every Texas county clerk to get early voting data. Sometimes you have to wait 20 minutes for an interpreter. I'm not kidding. No, there are county clerk's offices on the border states where there might be one English-speaking person there, and you're wanting to know about their early voting stuff. But so you contacted these clerks, and you got the number of people, what age group? I guess you're 18 to 25. What were you considering youth vote? How do you operationalize that?
Well, we're working under the assumption that by targeting these precincts that are in and around college
Right, yeah.
campuses, that we would be encompassing that age group.
Oh,
of
so you
college
just got the registration.
students. Total registration in that precinct.
Oh, and so because you couldn't get it by age, right? I was wondering how you, okay.
Yeah.
So another big EI problem there. But I was thinking, yeah, see, what I was gonna say is I thought it may be a better merit, if you wanted to really see, because this increase in turnout was youth, because I know the precincts you looked at, I know the 2 precincts in Mount Pleasant, that is where a lot of college students lives, but there are a lot of professors and a lot of other people that encompass that precinct. And how do you know if it was actually the college students that turned out, or the college students that got registered? There were registration drives on campus, but, because you're just, you're just taking that precinct's percentage, you've got that whole ecological inference. Maybe they all weren't college students that.
Sure, and I think, it's certainly, we're hamstrung by
Yeah.
how we do it and what information is available to us. But I also think that, I think back to I'm far more familiar with the precinct with which my undergrad was in, which was in the state of Kansas. And it was a much smaller university, 4,000 students, but we did have a very robust student ghetto around the university. Mm-hmm. And we did have college professors that lived there, but for the most part, the vast majority of people in that area, in and around the campus, were college students. And I think not only would the faculty make up a somewhat smaller, although I think it needs to be noted that they are voting in that precinct. That would also be I would guess, a much more consistent voting block over time. So any increases you could attribute to students rather than.
Yeah, well, I had okay, go ahead.
We also were a little bit spoiled simply by the fact that in Kalamazoo, the campus the precinct that includes the campus of Western is basically just the campus of Western.
Yeah.
And so we thought, hey, this is going to be great. How hard could this be? And it turns out it's certainly much more difficult. Most other places, because not everywhere do the precinct lines correspond so closely with the campus lines. And so the question then became, okay, how do we, what's the best way to figure out, what we would expect to be the most homogeneous precincts without knowing for sure exactly who lives where and so on and so forth. And so that's where the combination of precinct maps and also campus maps. You know, we did the best we could to try and figure that out.
Have you considered using the VNS or the exit polling and selecting ones that were done in communities? Because there you would get that individual level data. They ask them, are you a first-time voter? You know if they're young, if they're not, you know, and those are large enough samples that you can pick colleges all over the country to see about the, you know, and then you wouldn't have this trouble of, you know, this problem of, you know, I'm pretty sure most of them are youth, but we can't tell. But if you took something like the VNS or the, I think that's out now, and then the exit polling stuff that they eventually released to the public, that's done in so many different counties around the country that I'm sure, you know, 15, 20 university towns might be in there. And that way you would have that individual level so you can control for.
Sure.
You
Yeah,
know.
you control for age, and
Yeah.
I'll certainly let.
You know who they were, you know how old they were.
Yeah, I'll let John answer this,
Yeah.
but I would guess also that, I mean, because I've tried, not on this project, but I've tried to break down even like NES data with a huge sample into generational cohorts, and what you end up with that younger, when you break it down to like 18 to almost any survey format, when you break it down to 18 and 24-year-olds, you're just left with such a small sample that you can't even run a regression.
But like the VNS has 40,000 people, or the exit polling has, you know, 40, 50,000.
And that may be something that's we can take a look at. It's not even something we hadn't thought about before, but and particularly if what we find there is consistent with what we find using the homogeneous precincts, that would certainly reinforce what we're already doing.
Yeah. And finally, last one for Ken. I don't want to. I think I'm picking on Western students. You know, their CMU students can. How much of? I mean, you know, it's an excellent paper, obviously, but how much of kind of your idea is fairy tale land?
Is what?
Kind of fairy tale land. You know, wouldn't it be wonderful if? But we know that. I mean, there's been plenty of research shown that the media is driven by what the public wants. All right, and they're going to buy papers if it's got Tiger Woods crashing into a car, and so without going to
You mean entertainment versus
hard news.
hard news?
That it.
I mean, that's, you know, part of the responsibility of the press is also to entertain, too.
Oh, I know,
And
but
the issue, though, is what's the balance?
well, right, but they don't care about balance. They care about
think
profits.
that- I think the advantage, really, of new media is being able to target and provide opportunities for those who really want the hard news to get it. Maybe more so than the traditional print newspaper, which tries to be everything to everybody. Having that availability of being able to sort out what you want. And, you know, there's some people that are sort of taking the Orion approach that eventually there will be customized newspapers for every individual. And, you know, Gannett is actually, this is interesting, Gannett is now calls itself information centers. They don't call themselves newspapers anymore. And it's up to you to, it's all there, and you just select what you want. The question, though, is the economic model to support it.
Right, and then the one that you said that you supported, this kind of government nonprofit, but the government stays out.
Right.
How
Well-
plausible do you ever see something like that? I mean, couldn't you just see the ads? I mean, pictures of Soviet Russia, pictures of Castro. You know,
Yeah.
government-run newspapers. I mean, I could see them destroying that in the public's mind. It'd take about 2 weeks.
Right.
You know, and I just wonder. You know, it's a great idea, and
Yeah.
but
I don't, you know, I think you make a valid point, but I don't know how else to, I just would like to see maybe a low-profit or a nonprofit organization emerge to gather news, and it would be independent of any kind of government control. And it's going to happen because, you know, I didn't realize the Ann Arbor News hadn't made a nickel in 10 years. And it was only because it was owned by a very wealthy family that kept it going. And they finally just cut it. And this is going to happen more and more. And I think there's a demand for the information if it's accurate.
No, I agree that you're pointing out a huge problem we have. in
Yeah,
Hickory.
I don't have a lot of
I just
solutions
think the
yet.
number of people that care is so small.
I know.
That's what's sad.
Yeah, it is.
You know?
It's like voting.
That's exactly.
Let me, it's almost time for our reception, so let me just close with a couple of
Nice
comments.
job.
In,
Thank you.
You too.
When I'm not studying Michigan, I have an interest in regional politics, particularly in the South, and one of the things that always strikes me is there are so many people who study Southern, not just Southern politics, but the politics of individual Southern states. And one of the things that I'm constantly surprised at in preparing for this meeting is that there are so few of us that study Michigan as a case that can inform the way that we understand politics more generally. And I was just absolutely delighted with the fact that we had 3 papers that focused on Michigan for this meeting. And I think that, again, they're all quite good papers. At least 2 of them are award-winning papers. And it certainly is nice to be able to learn more about not just what goes on here in Michigan, but how what goes on here in Michigan and how that can inform the way that we think about politics more generally. And so I want to thank the panelists, thank the audience, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.